Have you ever hung up the phone and felt a weight in your chest, not because you argued, but because you were made to feel like the villain for simply saying no? It's a quiet kind of ache, not explosive, not loud, but hollow, like something inside you just sank. And it happens more often than we talk about, especially as we get older. When we start saying no, not because we don't care, but because we're finally learning to care for ourselves. But guilt has a way of sneaking in and making you question all of that. It's like a shadow in the corner of every conversation. After all I've done for you, or I guess I just won't bother you anymore. Or worse, nothing said at all, just silence heavy enough to choke on. If that sounds familiar, I want to say this clearly. You are not wrong for setting boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting your peace. And you do not deserve to be punished with guilt for choosing your own well-being. I've seen it happen to so many people, especially parents, especially mothers, especially those who've spent their lives giving, holding, helping, only to reach a point where the giving begins to cost more than they can afford to keep paying. That's what happened to Hannah, a dear friend of mine, a retired nurse who gave everything to her 2 sons. She worked night shifts, missed birthdays, scrimped and saved just to give them a better life, and she never complained. But now that she's in her 70s, she's tired. Not just physically, emotionally. One of her sons calls only when he needs something. A ride to the airport, a loan, help with the kids. If she ever says she's busy, he'll sigh deeply and say, "Okay, I guess I'll figure it out on my own." Every time, she feels the sting not just of guilt, but of being made to feel like her worth depends on always saying yes. I remember one afternoon she sat across from me at a cafe, stirring her tea without drinking it. "I raised him to be strong," she said, "but now I feel like I'm being punished for having needs." And in that sentence, I heard something so many of us never say out loud, that guilt can be a leash, a soft, invisible leash that keeps us tethered to roles we no longer have the strength or the desire to play. But here's what I told her, and what I want to tell you: you don't need to fight back. You don't need to argue or defend yourself or beg someone to understand your limits. Sometimes, all it takes is a few quiet replies that hold your dignity, without shame. Like the first one Hannah tried. The next time her son used that familiar line, "Fine, I guess I'll just figure it out," she paused, took a breath, and instead of rushing to fix it, she calmly said, "I trust that you will." That was it. She didn't scold him. She didn't explain herself. She simply returned the responsibility to where it belonged with him. And for the first time in a long time, she hung up the phone with a sense of peace. That's the power of soft boundaries. Because the people who use guilt as a tool are often counting on one thing: that you will break before they do, that your discomfort will make you bend. But what happens when you stop bending, when you learn to sit in your own stillness even while they pout, or sigh, or retreat? What happens is this: you stop being controlled, not by force, but by quiet refusal. That's what Margaret learned too. She's in her late 60s, lives alone, and used to rearrange her entire life around her daughter's last-minute needs. Doctor's appointments, babysitting, grocery runs, even when it meant canceling her own plans. And every time she tried to speak up, she'd get, "I guess I'll just have to ask someone else then." The implication hung heavy. "You've let me down." It wore her down for years, until one day, she said something small, but life-changing. "I understand that you're disappointed. I still can't do it today." Not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. And for the first time, her daughter didn't have anywhere to go with the guilt. There was no emotional loophole to slip through, just a boundary and a mother who finally trusted herself enough to hold it. That's what this journey is about. Not becoming cold, not pushing people away, but learning how to speak from a place of truth instead of fear. Fear says, if I say no, they'll leave. Truth says, if I never say no, I leave myself, and you've come too far, lived too much, and loved too deeply to keep abandoning yourself in the name of keeping the peace. Peace doesn't come from overgiving. It comes from living in alignment with your energy, your needs, your voice, You don't need to yell to be heard. You don't need to explain yourself to be valid. You don't even need to win them over. You only need to begin responding differently, with kindness, with firmness, with sentences that free you, not trap you. And when you do, something begins to shift, not always in them, but always in you. There's a reason guilt can get under your skin so easily it doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people you love most, people whose approval once meant everything, people whose comfort became your responsibility, people who learned, somewhere along the way, that your heart is soft enough to bend. And for many of us, especially in this season of life, we've been bending so long we forgot how to stand without apology. It often starts early. Maybe you were the peacemaker in your family, always smoothing things over. Maybe you were the helper, the one who didn't ask for much but gave everything. Or maybe love was offered only when you behaved a certain way. Quiet, compliant, accommodating, so when guilt shows up later in life, disguised as you never call anymore. Or, I guess I just don't matter. Something in you aches not just for the moment, but for every version of yourself that learned love had conditions. Helen, a retired librarian I know, told me something during a walk one morning. She said, "I've spent most of my life trying to be good enough for people who only noticed when I disappointed them. And I felt that maybe you do too. Because that's the power of emotional guilt. It trains you to doubt your own kindness. It makes you question whether your no means you're cold, whether your boundaries mean you're ungrateful, whether standing tall means pushing people away. But what I want to offer you today is something quieter, something firmer than guilt, and far gentler than anger. It's self-respect, the kind that says, I can love you deeply and still protect my peace. The kind that doesn't seek to punish or prove, but simply to stand still when others try to tug. That's what Frank began doing after decades of being the fixer in his family. He's 81, still sharp as a tack, and the kind of man who used to drop everything when someone called. One of his daughters got so used to his yes that when he finally declined helping her move because of back pain, she snapped. You never say yes when it really matters. Frank told me. I felt that old guilt rising up like a reflex. But then I thought, why is my value only measured by how often I say yes? So he replied, slowly and calmly, I'm sorry that it's frustrating. I know you'll figure it out. And that was it. No guilt, no justification, just trust in himself and in her. When we stop taking responsibility for other people's disappointment, we begin returning to ourselves. And that return is sacred. Chloe, a widowed mother of 3, had spent decades being the emotional cushion for her youngest son. He often used guilt like punctuation. I guess I was always the one you loved the least. He'd say it half joking, half serious, and she'd always rush to reassure him, over and over again, until one day she paused, took a breath, and said, that's not something I'll argue with anymore. It startled him, but it freed her, because here's the truth. You don't need to keep defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, especially if they're using guilt to control your reactions. Sometimes the best reply is no reply. Sometimes it's a quiet exhale and a redirect. I'm not having this conversation again. Let's talk when we're both calmer. You're allowed to be upset. I'm allowed to choose what I carry. These aren't comebacks. They're clarity, and clarity is the antidote to manipulation. Because when you start to live from a place of inner steadiness, guilt loses its grip. It may still knock on the door, but it won't find the old cracks to slip through. And the beauty of this shift is that it's not just about protecting yourself from harm. It's about rebuilding your relationship with yourself. You begin to trust your own instincts again. You stop over-apologizing. You stop filling in silences that were never yours to fix. You let others feel their discomfort without rushing to soothe it. That's not cruelty. That's growth. Grace, another friend of mine, finally stopped explaining why she didn't want to babysit overnight anymore. Her daughter had made her feel like saying no was a personal betrayal. You were always so involved with the others. But Grace simply replied, that may be how you feel, and I respect your experience. I still can't do it this weekend. She didn't try to unpack the past. She didn't beg to be understood. She just stood in her truth with love, but without guilt. And that's the lesson guilt can never teach you, that you are allowed to disappoint others, that you are allowed to not explain yourself, that you are allowed to say no and still be a good mother, a good friend, a good person. You are allowed to choose yourself, especially now, because this chapter of life isn't about constantly giving from a dry well. It's about replenishing, about dignity, about joy that doesn't come with strings. And when you begin to live like that, people notice. Some might pull away, some might resist, but the ones who truly care about your well-being, your full, whole self, they'll stay. And they'll learn, maybe slowly, but they will, because guilt may speak loudly, but peace speaks clearly. There's something deeply freeing that happens when you stop trying to win someone's approval. It doesn't mean you love them less. It just means you finally love yourself enough. And when you stop answering guilt, when you begin to respond with presence instead of panic, something in the air around you changes. Not loudly, not all at once, but unmistakably. The people who were used to pulling your strings suddenly don't know which ones to tug. Their scripts stop working. Their sighs fall flat. Their silence doesn't provoke. And in that space, something new is born. Respect, not because you demanded it, but because you stopped begging for it. Margaret, whom I mentioned before, told me about a Sunday dinner with her daughter, the kind of gathering that used to leave her emotionally bruised. There'd always be some offhand comment about what she didn't bring, or who she didn't invite, or how she hadn't been around enough. But this time, Margaret walked in differently, not guarded, just grounded. She didn't try to make everyone happy. She didn't fill the room with apologies. She simply brought a salad, set it down, and sat at the table like she belonged there because she did. And when the comment finally came, "It's been a while since you called," she just smiled gently and said, "Yes, I've been taking more time for myself lately." That was it. No panic, no over-explaining, no emotional cleanup afterward. And to her surprise, the topic changed. The air cleared. Sometimes. The greatest shift isn't in the words we say, it's in the energy we no longer carry. Because when guilt no longer finds a home inside you, it loses its power. Frank, who used to call himself a recovering fixer, told me about a moment with his granddaughter. She was upset he couldn't drive her to a concert. She pouted, rolled her eyes, and muttered, "Guess no one cares about my stuff." He told me he felt the familiar pang rise up the part of him that wanted to cancel his plans, rearrange everything, rush to prove his love, but he didn't. He took a breath, looked her in the eye, and said, "I care about you deeply. I also trust you'll find another way." She didn't like it, not at first, but she found a ride. And days later, she hugged him tightly before leaving his house. Because here's what we sometimes forget. When we model calm boundaries, we don't just protect ourselves. We teach others how to stand on their own feet. We say without saying, "I believe in you enough to let you feel uncomfortable." And we say to ourselves, "I believe in me enough to let love stop being a transaction." Love that requires guilt is not love. It's a bargain. And we are not here to bargain for our worth anymore. We've lived too long to keep giving up our peace for scraps of validation. There's a different kind of strength we step into now, not the kind that pushes back, but the kind that stands still. Like when you start replying with, "That doesn't work for me," instead of scrambling to justify, or when you say, "I'll need to think about that," instead of automatically agreeing, or simply, "I hear you, I still have to say no." These are not just replies. They're acts of self-respect. And over time, people begin to feel the boundary not as rejection, but as clarity, not as coldness, but as something steady and reliable. Even the ones who once used guilt most effectively. I've seen it in families over and over again. A mother stops over-functioning. A father stops tiptoeing. A grandparent stops over-giving. And suddenly, there's a pause. At first, yes, there may be protest. But eventually, something else. They begin to adjust. They begin to listen. And in some cases, beautifully, quietly, they begin to meet you where you are, not because you forced them to, but but because you stopped abandoning yourself to make them comfortable. That's how healing begins. Not with conflict, but with clarity. Not with confrontation, but with presence. And the reward is something many of us haven't felt in years. Peace that doesn't rely on someone else's mood. You begin to look forward to your mornings again. You go for a walk without replaying old conversations. You open the fridge and cook for yourself without guilt. You call a friend because you want to talk, not because you feel obligated. And your body notices, too. The tightness in your chest softens. Your breath deepens. Even your sleep comes easier, because guilt is exhausting. But self-respect, that's restorative. You begin to remember what it feels like to live on your own terms. You no longer brace for guilt to strike you. Trust that you can handle it when it does. And with every reply that honors your truth, you build a new pattern, one that tells your heart, you matter, too, not just as a helper, or a giver, or a placeholder, but as a human being worthy of kindness, even from yourself. So, if you've been living under guilt's shadow for years, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to stop justifying your no. You are allowed to step out of roles that no longer fit. You are allowed to live a quiet, meaningful life that doesn't require you to constantly prove your goodness. Because you are good. You are wise. You are already enough. And when you start believing that again, everything changes even if no one else does. If you're still here with me, still breathing slowly through these words, I want to thank you, not just for watching or listening, but for choosing to show up for yourself. Because I know how heavy this kind of pain can be. The guilt, the tension, the questions that don't seem to have answers. But maybe today, you took a small step toward freedom. Not the kind that's flashy or loud, the kind that whispers gently in your chest. I don't need to carry this anymore. And if you felt something shift even slightly, then I want you to know that matters. That's how healing begins. Not all at once. Not with perfect boundaries or flawless replies, but with a single moment of choosing yourself instead of your fear. That's what this journey has been about. Not just replies to say, in the heat of the moment, but replies that begin to echo from a deeper place inside of you. A place where guilt no longer takes the lead. A place where your presence, your dignity, your calm truth is enough. Because the truth is, you are not here to earn love by exhausting yourself. You are not here to fix everyone else while neglecting your own heart. You are not here to keep the peace by keeping yourself small. You're here to live, to rest, to feel joy again, even if others don't always understand it, even if they never say thank you, even if they never come around. You are still allowed to grow forward, and you don't have to do it alone. That's why I want to invite you, if you feel comfortable, to share your story in the comments. Have you ever felt manipulated by guilt? How did you start protecting your peace again? What helped you set your first boundary or your most important one? Because I believe your story could help someone else who's reading, someone who's still trying to find the courage to say, that doesn't work for me anymore. And if this video made you feel seen, I'd be honored if you stayed connected. Click the subscribe button, not because you owe me anything, but because I'd love for us to keep walking this path together. I make these videos not to preach or instruct, but to remind us all that we're still growing, even after 60, even after 70, even in the silence, even through the disappointment, even when the people we love try to make us feel small, because we're not small. We are whole. And each time you speak from that place of quiet strength, each time you choose peace over guilt, each time you answer with clarity instead of fear, you return home to yourself. That's the only kind of freedom worth having. So take your time, rest where you need to, say no when it feels right, and trust deep down that the relationships meant to stay will learn how to meet you where you are. You don't need to chase love. You don't need to carry it all. You don't need to be perfect. You only need to be honest, calm, steady, and most of all, free. Thank you for being here, for sharing your time, your attention, your beautiful, resilient heart. You deserve to be loved in a way that doesn't require you to disappear. And I promise you, that kind of love begins inside you. Until next time, take care of your voice, You've earned the right to use it with grace, with strength, and without guilt. You are not alone, not anymore.